What's up, Justin? I am so glad you're here on the show today. I'm really been looking forward to this.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, for anyone who's not familiar with you and your work or Clovis, can you just give us a little bit of background, a little bit of kind of just that quick rundown of how you got to where you're at and that like kind of the Clovis community you have?
Yeah, sure. I'm a bit of a serial entrepreneur, but my journey started in the music industry. So I had a 15-year music career, playing over 300 shows a year. I had a reality TV show on ABC by the time I was 25. And my whole health and wellness journey up till that point was basically vanity. I was a fat kid growing up and hated my body from the time I was a teenager, but was obsessed with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So it just was this sort of, we talked about this a bit off air, but like, a masochistic fitness journey of just crushing myself always. And was in my late 20s that my niece was born terminally disabled. And I can share that story with you if you want to dig into it. But that was really where I was exposed to like the horrors of mainstream medicine and just the awful things that can happen there, not because people are bad people, just because the system itself is broken. And that was when I started really deeply researching human metabolism, biology, and biochemistry. I made her a baby formula in my kitchen that then became my first e-commerce product. So, 8 years later, here we are. I now own Clovis. That's my nutritional supplement company. Another Amazon supplement company called MedChoice. And then I do coaching. I have online courses, and I have just a huge community of people who have had their lives transformed. So about 650,000 followers now. The private Facebook group has about 12,000 members, and people have my brand tattooed on their skin. So it's been pretty
Wow.
cool. Yeah.
I don't have that yet. That's maybe the next step. Maybe that's a
Yeah. Yeah.
2025 goal.
There you go. You'll get there, bro.
Get somebody to get a tattoo. I'll even comp
Yeah.
it. Yeah. If you're listening to this and you want $1 million body tattoo, like just send me a message. Let's talk about it.
100%, dude.
All right. So talk to me a little bit about, because I feel like we have similar stories. You came at this kind of from like a fat kid perspective growing up, but obsessed with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I came at it from like a really skinny kid obsessed with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Talk to me about like kind of your like journey through fitness. You mentioned that you were really into martial arts. You got a ton of different certifications. You were fully obsessed with it. So like walk me through like getting into it, kind of some of the mistakes you made early on, and then how it transformed, like the way you even look at fitness, or how it transformed you kind of in the process of exploring this and learning more.
Yeah, for me, I consider it my masculinity journey, honestly, because I grew up in New England, a very tough town in New England. I grew up fighting a lot. I played hockey for 10 years. All my uncles, my dad, a bunch of just like angry French Canadian kids, And I went into high school like almost 200 pounds, and I wanted to do something about it. I hated my body. I was so insecure. It was like I was the kid that like I was not going on a field trip where there was swimming involved. From a very young age, I was very aware that I did not like my body. And my dad, for some reason, wouldn't let us start lifting weights till we were 15. He had heard it would stunt our growth. So once day one of age 15 came, and I was lifting weights 2 hours a day, running on a treadmill every day, and started getting the weight off. But it became this really masochistic journey of fitness where everything I was doing was through the lens of I hate this body and I need it to be different. And in order for that to work, it has to get more and more and more extreme. So it started with bodybuilding in my mom's basement, as a teenager. And then when I got to music school in Boston, I started training with Rodney Toney, who was the former middleweight champion of California in boxing. So I was lifting weights at 5 a.m., then going to class, then riding a mountain bike to the gym and doing boxing. And then when I got to Nashville, obviously things got worse because I was literally under a spotlight. I was doing 300 shows a year on stage, and the TV show happened at 25. And so any insecurities I had about my body were just constantly amplified. So things got more extreme. It was like CrossFit 2-a-days, Olympic lifting. I hired a former Olympian to teach me Olympic lifting. I hired Pavel Tsatsoulin's guys from Strong First to learn kettlebells. And then I was tired of getting punched in the head. So I got into Jiu-Jitsu and 5 years of training and became a purple belt in Jiu-Jitsu. And it was just like, it wasn't until my early 30s. And I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole or not, but like it wasn't until my early 30s and my exploration of psychedelics that I realized the mental and emotional damage I was doing to myself of just, it was never going to be good enough. It didn't matter how low my body fat percentage got. At 9% body fat, I still thought I looked like shit, and I realized that there's an internal and a psychological game going on here that is not only not being addressed, it's being actively suppressed. And I realized that all of the extreme things I was doing, like if there was a Tough Mudder, I was signing up and running it, and it was like, I realized that it was actually an avoidance pattern. I was not doing any personal development work. So I'm on stage every night, getting drunk, living the rock star dream, and then crushing myself at workouts during the day. But I just was pretty deeply unhappy by the end of that music career.
Interesting. So from 15 to 25, you're going through this. You've experimented with a ton of different modalities. You've worked on your fitness under a lot of amazing coaches. there was never a point you looked in the mirror and you were like, I'm doing pretty good. It was always that like that self-deprecating, like a body dysmorphic pattern.
Totally. And you know, I wish I could say that I had a healthier experience with it, but I mean, for me, everyone's path is different. I'm sure there are a lot of people that just love fitness and it's nothing but positive for them. And I enjoy the physical act of fitness is the thing. But it was, you know, I was on stage every night and people were calling me sexy and hot and taking pictures with me and all this stuff. And I could not wrap my head around it. Like my self-worth was so low. Or like some girl would be like, oh my God, you're so hot. Take your picture with me. And I would just be like, what is she talking about? Like, I just didn't get it. So for me, it was pretty low in terms of my own confidence, self-worth, that kind of thing. Like I knew that I was very talented. I was always very, very sure of myself from a performance standpoint. But it was the physical, my body really that just drove me crazy.
That's so interesting. You know, even with all the accolades and people like giving you compliments and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like my journey was a little bit different. Like someone broke into my house when I was like 10, 11, 12, something like that. And I was home alone and was like super, super scared, hid under my bed with a steak knife. And I feel like at that moment, I could probably wouldn't be able to put it in words, but I was resolved to not ever feel that sense of like helplessness and lack of autonomy. And I think that's what's really spurred on a lot of my journey. So it was a lot of the like, I'm not good enough. I'm not strong enough. And I need to be better and better and better to like be able to push back against that. So I went through kind of similar journey, you know, started lifting weights at 14, 15. And then it wasn't until I started, like I became a trainer, like right out of college and started working in that. And I still wasn't getting the results that I was really looking for. But I think that was ended up being a blessing in disguise that I wasn't necessarily as jacked as I wanted to be or as big and as scary and tough. You know, I just realized I just needed to grow a big beard. It was kind of that. It was the main thing I was missing.
That's a Jedi move.
That's right. But it eventually shifted slowly over time for when I was like running away from this fear of helplessness to being like, I'm running now towards something where I feel like when I work out, I'm more energized. I have better like relationships with other people around me. I feel like I bring more to the table. And there was no like defining like moment for me, this light bulb where I was like, oh, it's positive now. It just seemed like it morphed over time into this chasing positivity, chasing performance and improvement rather than running from fear and kind of like this helplessness. Did you have anything along those lines, like in your journey where you were like, oh, I kind of see the positive side of this thing? Or, you know, like you mentioned psychedelics. Was there a point where you were like, oh man, like I've been looking at this wrong? And how was that for you?
Totally, bro. I mean, I love fitness so much. Like, I still train 6 days a week. I love it. I never stopped loving fitness and I never stopped fitness. There wasn't some moment where I was like, fitness is bad for me. Let me stop. Like the longest I've ever gone without training is 6 weeks. And it's because I got surgery, right? Like I've never like purposefully taken time off. But that shift for can fitness be good for me and beneficial for my life? Well, one, unknowingly it was, right? If you want to put in the discipline of, you know, I was 160 pounds deadlifting 425, like if you put in that amount of discipline or you become a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, like there is so much personal development happening that you're completely unaware of. At the time, I wasn't aware of it. But it was actually after my first psychedelic experience was ayahuasca in the jungle. So
wow, I went going hard right off the bat.
I went hard right out of the gate. Yeah, 8 days, 4 ceremonies, right? And when I came back, I was literally in a CrossFit gym doing thrusters for time. I remember whatever watt it was had like thrusters for time.
Fran, probably.
Yes, probably. And I remember like I put the barbell on the ground and I was just like mid-workout, I was like, I'm hurting myself. And the rest of the class keeps going. I take the weights off, put them away, put the barbell away. I walked out of the gym and I stopped CrossFit that day. Wow. And then I just started working on mobility and I got into a little bit of yoga and I was still doing some powerlifting and stuff like that and kettlebells. So I was always continued to train. I just did it in a way that was like, there's a fine line between like, you know, David Goggins gets a knee replacement surgery. 2 days later, he's on stage with someone doing 100 push-ups with like his new knee. You know, like there's a fine line between like the hurting yourself and doing something that's beneficial. But for me, it really wasn't until my early 30s when it shifted from a place of I'm doing this because I hate my body while also loving the activity to loving the activity and loving the way that it made my body feel. So I just had to switch the way that I was training. And that was when I got really in touch. I started doing somatic work with a coach. So I started learning somatic work and learning more about my body and my emotional expression, which is why I say it's a journey of masculinity. It was like all that I knew is like I was either happy or I was angry and I was going to choke somebody. That was my full spectrum of emotions, you know? And once I tapped into the emotional experience and somatic practices of learning how to listen to my body, my training actually got significantly better. I got much better at jiu-jitsu. I got much better with mobility and all these things. It started working better because if I woke up one day and I felt absolutely terrible, I wasn't going to force myself to go do Fran and get in the cold plunge. I was going to listen to my body. That was the shift.
So I feel like I talk to a lot of people who, if listening to their body was going to serve them, their body's going to tell them to eat Oreos and never work out.
100%.
How do you draw that distinction between like someone like yourself who was training 6 days per week, pushing yourself way into the red zone to the point where you're not necessarily recovering, you're doing it kind of out of like, almost anger towards yourself versus someone who's like on the other side of the fence and has never really gotten into that fitness side of things, maybe still has a disordered relationship with themselves, maybe doesn't love themselves the way they probably should. What advice would you give that person?
Just what you said, they don't love themselves the way that they should. People come to me for weight loss, almost everybody. Like virtually all my clients, 85% of my clients are women. They're mostly all obese and have been for decades. Most of them are sedentary, right? So they're not like fitness people coming to learn how to get better at fitness. And they come to me for weight loss. The first thing I have them do, the very first exercise is a food and you journal prompt where they go back in time to when they were a kid and the things they learned about food and saw from their parents. Second thing they do is they stand in a mirror, look themselves in the eyes, and they say, I love you 10 times. And they try to mean it as much as they can. And this is where I get the most pushback. I mean, women burst into tears the first time they try this. Men, I'm not doing that, right? They're just like immediately, they're like, I'm not doing this woo-woo shit, bro. So it really is the shift of trying to get the bicep curl, as I call it, of self-love. Like self-love is a practice just like anything else. If you want bigger biceps, you got to do bicep curls. If you want to learn to love yourself and you don't yet, you got to practice loving yourself. So that's the part that we get to. And the other piece, like I know that we talked about this before we recorded, this is why I'm so big on the food versus poison, because I'm trying to help people see that most, if not all of the health consequences we have in America are due to what's called the low energy state. Your cells don't have enough fuel. They're not creating enough ATP. Depressed and anxious subjects in clinical studies, they generate 20% less ATP. So depression is a low energy problem. And I don't know how many women I've gotten off SSRI medications, probably hundreds at this point. So that's where we have to start. Like you're saying, I always tell people the goal is intuitive eating. But if you're 200 pounds overweight and you're completely sedentary and your house is full of junk food, we cannot trust your intuitive eating. We have a lot of work to do and a lot of training. You have to learn the ropes. We have to build a foundation of your pyramid before we can trust you to do the intuitive eating. So if I can start fueling, instead of focusing on restriction, starvation, suffering, and sacrifice, if I can teach you nourishment, giving nutrient-dense whole foods to your body, not poisoning yourself, your mindset will slowly shift. Your cells will create more energy, and all of a sudden, your motivation to do things goes up. But it's a stepwise process.
So when you're talking about cellular energy, it sounds like one of the big problems that you're seeing is that just a lack of nutrient density. So the foods that people are eating are highly processed, low in vitamins, low in minerals, low in micronutrients, and therefore are not giving the body the energy they need. Is that the main problem you're seeing? Or because you mentioned people with depressive subjects have a 20% like reduction in cellular energy. Is that a cause or an effect? Correlation, causation? What do you think?
Yeah. So the symptom is less ATP. So the symptom of these depressed people is they're making less energy. The reason why they're making less energy is multifaceted. So one, it is lack of vitamins and minerals, like you said, lack of nutrient density. But two, it's poison. So what's happening is because of the ultra processed food environment that we live in, we've broken cellular function. And this is where people start to get in the weeds of like, are seed oils safe? Are seed oils not safe? So you have to actually study biology to figure out how these things are working, right? Like you have glycolysis and beta oxidation through the citric acid cycle down to the electron transport chain. And that's where ATP is created. But there's a phospholipid membrane in your mitochondria that's made of fat. And if it's made of polyunsaturated fats, like a bunch of these PUFAs from seed oils, you're going to create less energy because that membrane becomes permeable. It's like, imagine a dam where you want the water to run through one channel to produce a lot of energy, and you just poke a whole bunch of holes in it. So now water is rushing out everywhere, and it's creating far less energy. But the reason for that is twofold. It is the lack of nutrients, yes, but it's also these metabolic toxins that are disrupting how your metabolism works. So we have to fix it from both angles.
I like that you're bringing up seed oils because I feel like this is a contentious subject. A lot of like these, a lot of evidence-based people are like, they're fine. Look at all the studies. They lower LDL cholesterol.
Mhm.
but we're not necessarily taking like a macro viewpoint and looking at like the cellular membranes like you're mentioning, right?
Mhm.
And like done in isolation or done in these like studies that are only focusing on this one other metric like
Yep.
LDL, you're
Yep.
not seeing the full spectrum of benefits or consequences. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other like environmental toxins that you were mentioning earlier and some of the ways that people are poisoning themselves unknowingly?
Yeah. So a big well, one and to touch on the seed oils thing, it's like you're right.
Touch on it. Just
If
touch it.
yeah,
Just keep touching it.
if we're looking for one specific marker, right, there are sometimes we'll say, well, we have a randomized control trial that shows that these seed oils actually lower inflammation in humans. Okay, well, that's a metabolic ward study that was set up to measure inflammation levels in the body. So if we say day one, HSCRP or measure of inflammation was X, and then day three, inflammation was Y, and Y is lower than X, we say, hurrah, seed oils lower inflammation. What we're not thinking about is the mechanisms of how that is happening. PUFAs, by default, lower immune function. If you lower immune function, you're going to have lower inflammation levels because your immune system's not doing what it's designed to do. For instance, like after an organ transplant, you can load the human body up with polyunsaturated fats and make it less likely that their body will reject that organ. Because the rejection of the organ is the immune system saying, we don't like this invader, get rid of it. It's a natural process because having an organ transplant is a very unnatural thing, right? So we have to shut that immune system down. But you'll see a headline that says seed oils reduce inflammation. And everybody just says, okay, inflammation bad, therefore seed oils are good because they're reducing inflammation. But we're not looking at the fact that it's actually suppressing immune function. And if you were to measure those people out, seed oils stay in your body for over 6 years, man. So if you want to track those people or make them live in a metabolic ward for 6 years, which is literally impossible, we're never going to have a safety study on seed oils that basically validates or clarifies this argument. The study is not going to happen. So it's up to you if you want to wait for definitive science or you want to look at some of these N=1 and the anecdotal stuff we see out in the world, or the fact that obesity has been on the rise for 70 years. And that's when seed oils came into the diet and the average
The
American.
weirdest thing. Yeah.
Exactly. The average American is getting 3 to 5 tablespoons a day without knowing it. It's in white bread, for God's sake. The seed oils are everywhere. So we have to be really careful about the studies. It's so easy for some PhD or something to be like, they lower inflammation. They're good. And like you said, they lower LDL. Well, for lowering LDL to be a good thing, we have to assume that LDL is bad. We have to assume that cholesterol is a bad thing. Cholesterol is a precursor to all your sex steroid hormones, including testosterone. So let's not villainize cholesterol. You see what I'm saying? It's way more complex than people think.
100%. Yeah. And when you're only looking at these like headlines on Instagram, because people aren't reading the full articles, much less the actual studies. We're looking at headlines, right? It's so easy to be confused, right? And the thing that I keep coming back to is like, regardless of how anything shakes out from a cellular function, when we're looking at omega-6 fatty acids, those are going to, put your body in a state of that negative inflammation. And most people have a, omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of like 20-1 when it should be 1-1.
Exactly.
And so if all you're consuming is seed oils, then you're going to keep raising that ratio. And I think that in itself is a good enough reason to just try to avoid them.
Yeah.
So, but then you go back to like what you're talking about with like the cellular function and the cellular energy and like suppressing immune function. And now that's like 5 are good reasons. So if in case you were curious about seed oils, there you have it right there.
Yeah.
Clip that out, post it on the internet, send $1 million to it.
For sure. And like who with like a bunch of kids and a 40-hour work week and a spouse and like, who's going to go do this studying? Who's going to like, nobody. My favorite example, there was a study that came out years ago. You might remember it. It was like 2 eggs is the equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes. Today, right?
That's right.
So that study, right? One, it's behind a paywall. So the average user can't go read that scientific study unless they want to pay $40 to some journal, which is what I did. And I went and read the study. Right? And some of the foods that they were counting as like a serving of eggs was cake batter and cheesecake. Because there's eggs in it, right? So it's like, okay, this is amazing science, right? So we really got to be careful with science, man. Like, honestly, at this point, anyone who doesn't realize that science is a marketing funnel for big pharma and big food, if you don't realize that yet, you got more work to do.
Like that's the follow-up question is who paid for that study?
Exactly.
It wasn't Big Egg. Tell you that right now.
No. And then it gets real tricky, right? Because these food companies realize, like Coca-Cola is one of the biggest funders of the American Diabetes Association.
And how much do they pay towards medical schools? How much do they donate there?
Exactly. Oh, a ton, right? And that's the thing, right? So the food companies caught on to this. Oh, people are seeing our name in a conflict of interest on the funding for these studies. So then they do things like start nonprofit organizations. There's a nonprofit called the ILSI, which is the International Life Sciences Institute. And their stated mission is like, we fund nutrition science for the betterment of humanity, right? So now you'll see nutritional studies that say funded by the International Life Sciences Institute. That sounds very warm and fuzzy. And then you go look at who owns ILSI. It is all big food companies. It's Kraft, it's Coca-Cola, it's Pepsi, it's Red Bull. They all band together and they start these nonprofits and they fund a bunch of science that says ultra-processed foods are good.
So are you saying that one of the best things we could do for our physical health, our emotional health, and like just getting to a place where we're holistically in good shape would be eating whole unprocessed foods?
100%.
Radical,
That's it.
radical idea.
Yeah. And I can tell you definitively because I've been taking the arrows for 8 years, right? Is like, if you say that on the internet, hey, eat single ingredient whole foods that exist in nature, you are going to get called a quack. You're going to be accused of spreading misinformation. You're going to get called dangerous, even if you have 1,000+ transformation stories of clients that you've helped.
Wow. So what other toxins that are we just not seeing, not aware of, that we're ingesting on a daily basis? Where else are we getting these poisoning ourselves from?
Yeah, there's the ingested ones of like, artificial flavorings and sweeteners. Food dyes are a big one. Now that we have like, I think it's a bipartisan issue, but like RFK and Make America Healthy and everything, like one of the first things he's doing is trying to get the FDA to ban these food colorings like red dye. He's also talking about banning seed oils. So basically anything you can't pronounce on a label or anything like red dye or blue 5 or whatever, like you want to get rid of those artificial colorings, the dyes, the artificial sweeteners, the artificial flavorings. And beyond that, you have to think about what foods are species appropriate. So the way that I describe species appropriate diet is like you could go hiking every day in the wilderness for the rest of your life and you will never stumble upon a bagel tree. It's not going to happen,
That's a
right?
really
So
good point, actually.
yeah, like monocropping, which is what most of our agriculture system is unbelievably unnatural. You're never going to find 1,000 acres of corn in the wild, right? You have to you have to completely obliterate an entire ecosystem. Billions of animals, bugs, rodents, everything, clear cutting trees, using pesticides to get rid of the weeds. Like it's an extremely unnatural thing that we're creating out in the world to give people something like wheat and gluten that disrupts metabolic function, right? So there's all these arguments about it, but the way that we look at things is really twisted because if somebody has, say, celiac disease, they eat gluten and they have a reaction, we look at it as there's something wrong with their body instead of the other direction of maybe we're feeding them something that doesn't belong in the human metabolism. If we can shift that lens, everything changes. And like right now, you and I are just talking about the ingestibles. And then we don't even get to environmental stuff of like, are you drinking tap water? I'm in Austin. The tap water has like 300+ chemicals in it. Are you wearing polyester underwear? Are you a woman who's slathering on deodorant and makeup that are xenoestrogens or what's called estrogenics that are making you estrogen dominant? Is the air in your home clean? Do you have mold toxicity? It's a lot to think about. It can be a bit overwhelming, but these metabolic toxins are hitting us from all angles, which is why it becomes imperative to nourish your body in a way in which your immune system is functioning properly.
So you mentioned overwhelm, and I do think that the first step in this journey is like I'm going to work out, I'm going to get fit, right? And then you're like, well, I'm going to start eating healthier, and then you're like, well, I'm going to start eating single ingredient foods. Then all of a sudden you're like throwing out seed oil and getting rid of deodorant, and and you kind of make this big like shift way over on this side. How do you recommend people navigate this when there is literally so much that could kind of cause that like anxiety response if you really chose to look at the full spectrum of how like the industrial culture that we're in is just putting out toxins into the environment, into our bodies, and that sort of thing. How do people get started without feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, I mean, the best I can do is try to baby step people that come into my ecosystem and are communicating with me, right? So like my Instagram handle is Justin Nault Official. If you DM me and ask me for my foods list, I'm going to give you a foods list. It's 110 foods to choose from. It's more variety than you could ever need in your life, and it's all single ingredient whole foods. You could literally only eat foods on that list, and that's it. Like you don't have to count calories, you don't have to track macros, you don't have to work. You can go for walks in the sunshine. You're going to be fine. Your entire metabolic situation over time is going to completely transform. Because my belief is that all of your chronic health conditions are the result of your body never having had a long enough period of time with no poison coming into it. Like baby formula is toxic. That's how I got into this. My niece was in the pediatric ICU with a hole in her stomach, being fed a toxic hydrogenated vegetable oil baby formula directly through a G tube at weeks old. That's why I do this. That's why I got so angry, and my early podcasts are so aggressive, like ranting about this stuff, because it really is quite simple. If you just remove the poison and give yourself nutrient dense foods, that's 90% of the battle easily. And then when it comes to moving your body, it's like go for 10-minute walks after each meal, get some sunshine on your skin, sleep 7 to 8 hours a night. That's it, man. You don't have to be a CrossFitter. You don't have to train jiu-jitsu. It's very simple.
I like that. I love the 10-minute walks after each meal. That's one of the big like cornerstones of my program. Just, improving metabolism, improving digestion, getting out in the sunlight.
Yeah.
I like that. I like the focus on simplicity and the idea of just honing in on the foods that you're putting into your mouth. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great place to start, and it's going to give people a lot of what they want as well as what they need too. So
100%. And it seems like, do you work with a lot of like high performers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Most of my clients are entrepreneurs in some capacity.
Cool. Yeah. I'll give you an example, man. I was on stage. I speak at events, and I was on stage in Orlando at a e-commerce entrepreneur event. So it's like 200 plus people that are all 7, 8, and 9-figure founders. Like these people have all the money in the world to handle their health and wellness. So I'm on stage, and all the questions are like, what blood markers should I be measuring? What peptide is going to give me X? How many minutes should I be in the cold plunge? And how many hours should I intermittent fast? Right. So I finally I just both hands on the microphone, took a deep breath. I was like, listen, everybody, quick question. How many people in the audience right now identify as a biohacker? 3 hands go up. The other 200 hands are empty. You see what I'm saying? So I was like, all right, listen, we got to pause here because 75% of people are overweight or obese. So if you're asking me which peptide, how many minutes in the cold plunge, how many hours to intermittent fast, when you're working in front of your computer and you're still eating Doritos and Red Bull, we don't get to ask those questions yet because those are higher up on the pyramid, right? That there's a hierarchy to this. We need to build the foundation first. If you're still poisoning yourself at every meal, it doesn't make sense to start talking about peptides and cold plunges.
100%. You miss the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
Yeah. So go back to talking a little bit about baby formula, because this is something that we ran into with my kids. We're looking at baby formula, just had a kid, and we're like, everything's got hydrogenated seed oils, corn oils, soybean oils in it. We had to end up buying some special formula from Germany just to get something that didn't have seed oils in it.
I know. It's outrageous.
Do you know with like the history of that at all? I'm unaware, but I do remember, I do know that like back in the day in like the 60s and 70s, it was touted as like, this is better than breast milk. And so like, if you are wealthy, you should be giving your kids like this formula. It's because it's better.
Yeah. And that has to do with the villainizing of saturated fats, which goes back to Procter and Gamble, right? So when I started explaining to people that this is all a big marketing funnel, like all day, every day, and you know this because you're a digital entrepreneur, right? It's like, once you learn what a marketing funnel is, I challenge you, like anywhere you are, you're just driving around in your neighborhood and you look around and you say, whose funnel am I in? Because you're always in somebody's funnel, right? Mm-hmm. And that it's the same thing with baby formula. So Procter and Gamble, way back when, I think in the 1950s, they had this industrial waste product that was cottonseed oil. And they created this product called Crisco. Crisco is just like hydrogenated cottonseed oil when it first came out. But they needed to convince people that the fats they were consuming at the time, it was all like whole milk, butter, whole eggs, So they had to convince people that animal fats were bad. Yeah, exactly. So the American Heart Association was a completely obscure company. Nobody knew who this organization was, and they had zero funding for their research. They were just a blip on the radar. So Procter & Gamble comes along, pays them $1 million, says, we're going to fund all your research, but we need you to do XYZ study that shows that saturated fat is bad, polyunsaturated fats are good, so we can promote these seed oils. That's the equivalent of $21 million today. So this puts the American Heart Association on the map. And all of a sudden, seed oils start just flying off the shelves. Everyone's cooking with Crisco. And this followed into the baby formula thing, where it became that saturated fats are bad for heart health, polyunsaturated fats are good for everything under the sun, and it ended up in baby formula. We also have to remember, we did not know anything about human cells, really, until about the 1970s with electron microscopes and all this stuff. So one of the biggest mistakes that happened with baby formula is scientists had no idea what the gut microbiome was. And there are these prebiotic dietary fibers in natural breast milk that's called human oligosaccharides. And the way that we see it is the human digestive system, we can't digest dietary fiber. So doctors look at it as these are useless. Let's remove them. So they end up making these baby formulas with no prebiotic fiber. So the baby's gut microbiome never flourished. Because while humans, we can't digest the fiber, it's not going into our bloodstream, it does feed the beneficial bacteria in our gut microbiome that are running the show. So a lot of this is really just hubris, where like scientists always think that they know what's best and they're always trying to outsmart nature. And then the ball starts rolling down the hill and the momentum is too strong. You can't fix the problem once it's already been done. And the big issue we have today with the corruption between big food and government organizations is the FDA regulates heavily anything that is an ingestible for babies under 12 months old. So again, when my niece was in the pediatric ICU, she was having over 300 seizures a day. She was given less than 3 years to live. I mean, it was a death sentence. And they put her on this ketogenic baby formula because I don't think people realize this, but in medical settings, the ketogenic diet is to suppress epileptic seizures. Savannah did not turn out to be epileptic, but they gave it a shot. And every baby in the pediatric ICU gets a formula by Gerber, a company that's owned by Nestle, that is a high-fat, low-carb baby formula. Nobody pays attention to the fact that all of those fats are hydrogenated vegetable oils. So I brought that to the attention of a world-class neurologist who was a really good guy, and I think he was trying to help us. But he looked at the label and the ingredients, and he said, I never thought to check that. And that was the podcast started shortly after that. And I started studying biology and biochemistry, and I made a baby formula for Savannah in my kitchen. And I mean, it was game on from then on. And that's when I started building community on the internet.
Wow. So take us full circle here. So like if you could go back in time and talk to maybe your 15, 18-year-old self who was dealing with a lot of these, like the insecurity and sort of like the hatred for yourself and using that to like fuel your workouts, essentially, what would you go back and tell yourself, someone in your shoes in that time period?
Man, I struggle because I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a 15-year-old. It's like, what could I say that would help that little version?
Maybe go a little bit more frontal cortex development then.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would get into somatic work as quickly as possible. Like when
you say somatic, are you talking about like breath work specifically, or just kind of feeling your body?
Great question. Yeah. So somatic basically means of the body. Like the definition of the word is of the body. So I actually hired a coach that was teaching me like rage practices. I was like smashing pillows and screaming and like learning how to cry when I was upset. Right. So with men, I do a lot of masculinity coaching, and I use anger and rage as a side door because we're usually so comfortable expressing rage, right? Because that's appropriate. So I can get men to do these rage practices, and sometimes that rage turns into an emotional break. Breath work, same thing. If we do deep breath work, we'll also get these huge emotional responses, a lot of crying, a lot of sobbing, and it feels uncontrollable. So we go back to another dam analogy. It's like you're chipping away at the Hoover Dam with the screwdriver, and eventually it breaks. And then for me, I had 32 years of suppressed emotions that had to come rushing out of me, So I think that what I would do with my teenage self is take on a mentorship role and maybe start martial arts earlier, because martial arts is a very fantastic way to squash some of the toxic masculinity of like, it's like you said, right? The steak night story. I'm actually very scared and I'm very insecure and I don't feel capable. And I'm going to puff my chest out and scream and yell and throw haymaker punches because I don't feel safe. Right.
And I feel like the gym is filled with men with that, like
100%.
Scared little boys who are absolutely jacked out of their minds.
Absolutely.
But martial arts is a little different because it brings you that level of confidence. I just started jiu-jitsu like 2 years ago, got my blue belt last Monday. So I'm like,
amazing,
right there
bro.
in it. Yeah.
Congrats, man. I love that. And it's so good for you because again, I told you when I was at peak powerlifting, when I was deadlifting 425, I went to my first jiu-jitsu class. And I got
I already know how this story goes and I love it.
Dude, this guy was like, he's his 6th degree black belt. He's like in his 50s. He's an insurance salesman with like a big beer belly. And I mean, he must have tapped me 10 times in 2 minutes. And I'm drenched in sweat. I'm huffing and puffing. I'm way stronger than this guy. And he's not even breaking a sweat. He's not even breathing heavily. Like I felt like I was a kindergarten child being manhandled by a full-grown man. Yes. And it was great for my ego. It was very, very good.
That's my exact same experience too. Coming in, getting beat up by like 16-year-olds, women, dudes who, way, way less than me, guys who are fat, just like being like, what have I been doing my whole life? And it just gave you a whole new lens on what does it actually mean to be physically fit and capable.
Yeah. And it's also an interesting place because I think a lot of what we're dealing with is men's emotions. We've not had safe spaces to express emotions and be held in them. Like I have a great relationship with my mom now, but my mom was not affectionate and she knows she wasn't affectionate. Her mom was not affectionate, right? We have all these cycles. Jiu-jitsu is a very odd place because you have someone who could absolutely kill you. And you are entering into an agreement with them. You're shaking hands and saying, let's go. I'm going to try my best here. They can get you in a rear naked choke and end your life. But you tap and they release and they say, hey, buddy, good job. And they give you a fist bump. Like you're being held in a safe space. You're expressing yourself with your body. You're going through all of this emotional and psychological experience. And you're being held in a safe container with somebody that you can trust.
It's consensual roughhousing. I love it.
100%. Absolutely.
And there's something to also be said for like, I wake up, I do my 6 a.m. classes. So I like wake up and they're like, all right, you're in side control. And there's some guy just like gets on top of you and just gives you a hug first thing in the morning. And you're like, I do like to snuggle. Thank you so much.
Totally, man. Jiu-jitsu cuddle puddle.
It's a lot of fun. I'm surprised it took me 30 minutes to talk about jiu-jitsu because I'm like, hey, my name's Nate. Did you know I do jiu-jitsu? Like that's like, comes right up.
100%, dude. It's like when you first start, it's like vegan, right? So how long is this vegan going to go without telling me that they're vegan? It's jiu-jitsu is very much that way.
Yeah. I get 3 minutes most of the time. Like it's pushing it.
Nicely done, dude.
Justin, this has been such a fun conversation. I love your philosophy and the way you are helping people get not only in physically fit, but also developing that mental health, developing like the tools that they need to be more secure in their manhood, love themselves more, and just generally fostering that holistic view of health that I think is pretty rare to see a lot in the fitness industry that is so focused on macros and carbs and intermittent fasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So can you just tell us, I know you have a free training. Can you tell us where people can go to get that and what they're going to get when they get that?
Sure. Yeah. JustinNault.com/free is just a free training video that walks you through what I do and some of the major myths. Like I talk about calorie counting, I talk about punishing yourself in the gym and how you can kind of flip these things on their head and you can get fantastic results in a way that doesn't feel like you're just suffering all of the time, right? Like you can do this from a place. I always say that like mainstream diet and fitness is suffering, sacrifice, and self-loathing. And the way that I do things is nourishment, abundance, and self-love. It's a different lens and you can get far more sustainable results because it doesn't suck so badly while you're doing it. And if you want to do hard things, right? I do nutrition for UFC fighters. It's like, if you want to do hard things, I'm your guy. I can help you with that as well. But anything you want to learn from me, the best way is just go to Instagram, Justin Nault Official, send me a DM and I will be the guy that responds. And we're going to have a conversation back and forth. And I would love to chat with you and find out what you got going on.
Awesome. Justin, this has been a ton of fun, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you dropping in and sharing some wisdom.
Thank you, man. It's been a pleasure.